Stanford University.
Let me begin with a story that really shapes how I've been thinking about this museum. And that is, it's a story that when early in my career at the Smithsonian, I was asked to do an exhibition on the history of the 19th century. And one part of that exhibition, I wanted to look at the story of enslavement. But I wanted to do it in a different way. So I wanted to focus on a particular plantation. So I traveled all around the country looking at plantations. I went to sugar plantations in Louisiana, cotton plantations in Alabama, tobacco farms in North Carolina and Maryland, and then I found this amazing plantation. It was a rice plantation called the Friendfield Plantation outside of Georgetown, South Carolina. And when I drove down the road and turned the corner, standing in front of me were 15 slave cabins extant from the 1850s. And next to the cabin was a man named Mr. Johnson, never knew his first name. He was in his 90s, and he had lived in that cabin with his slave grandmother. So as you could imagine, for a historian, this is the Holy Grail, to talk to somebody that really could help you understand how the enslaved lived in this kind of house. So he took me and was just wonderful. He took me to the front of the cabin, and he talked about how the enslaved Africans did a hard sweep. They used a broom to sweep the ground so it became so hard that there'd be no grass or no vermin could be there. Then he took me to one side, and he talked for 20 minutes about the role of children, watching the chimney, making sure it didn't fall or catch on fire. Then he took me to the back of the cabin, and he talked about the crops that his enslaved grandmother grew to supplement what the master gave them. And then I went to the fourth side. Mr. Johnson didn't come. I said, Mr. Johnson, what happened over here? He said, I'm not going over there. I said, Mr. Johnson, please, tell me what happened over here. He said, boy, I'm not going over there. Finally, I did what all good Washingtonians do. I say, listen, I came all the way from your nation's capital. Please, tell me what happened here. He said, I'm not going. And I said, why not? He said, because there's nothing but rattlesnakes over there. Now, I got to be honest, after I stopped running, I asked Mr. Johnson, why didn't you tell me? And he said to me, he said, people always knew, they always remembered, but now people have forgotten. And he said to me, my words, not his, but what he really said was, if you're really a historian, then your job is to help people remember not just what they want, but what they need. And in some ways, that desire to help people remember and know what they need about the African American experience has been really at the core of the struggle to create a National Museum of African American History and Culture. This struggle to create this museum has been going on for 100 years because the National Mall, that space from the Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial, that space is really the place where millions come to learn what it means to be an American. And African Americans struggled to find a presence in that place. And this struggle goes back to 1913. In 1913, we all remember there are those wonderful pictures of aging Yankees and aging rebels shaking hands, saying the war is over on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. But if you remember, you never see any African Americans in those pictures. And suddenly, African Americans said, 200,000 of us fought in this war. Why are we not part of this celebration? That, and then shortly thereafter, the birth of a nation. The story that reframed the Civil War in a way that was, shall we say, not kind to the African American. And this led a desire to craft a black presence on the mall. And money was raised, there was land even acquired. Then World War I breaks out. The idea dies. The idea lies fallow until Calvin Coolidge, at the end of his term, yes, I did say Calvin Coolidge, at the end of his term, decided that he was going to help create a museum of colored America on the mall. And he rallied support from the NAACP and many others. But by the time the momentum was built, the Great Depression hit. No museum. The idea floats around again after Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1968. And as you know, we now have a monument to Dr. King that will open in August. But again, no traction for a museum. But then in the 90s, it really seemed like it was going to happen. Legislation passes the House and is about to pass the Senate when let's see how I say this, less than a great friend of the black community, Jesse Helms, basically demanded that the Senate not pass the legislation, so the idea dies. But it's not until 2003 that legislation to create this museum is passed and signed by George W. Bush. And the question really is, why finally successful in 2003? I think, first of all, there was a sense among many Americans that the civil rights generation was beginning to pass from the scene. And there was a reframing of the civil rights as a feel-good story where black and white came together to transform America. So people said, we've got to capture that history. We've got to interview these people before they go. And this got momentum to create a national museum. But also, 2003, there was a bipartisan effort. Usually this was an effort done by Republicans and then later by Democrats. But in 2003, they were able to get a bipartisan effort led by John Lewis, of course, of SNCC, one of the great heroes of our country. But his partner was Senator Sam Brownback from Kansas, who you wouldn't expect to be a partner in this. But that bipartisan approach was able to get the legislation passed. But I would also argue it came to fruition because we had 50 years of amazing scholarship around African American history and issues of race. And it's that scholarship that gave the Smithsonian the kind of confidence that this is a story that can be told. But it also didn't hurt that there was now a middle class of African Americans who could afford to support a cultural institution like a museum. All of that led to this becoming a reality at 2003. And in 2005, I came back from Chicago to run this museum. So the question really is, if you're going to create a national museum, what is it? What is the vision for a national museum? And I thought long and hard about this, because when they asked me to come back, I initially turned down the job. Think about it. If somebody said to you, build a national museum from scratch, with no staff, no collections, no money, no site on the mall, no architect, and a lot of different opinions, why would you say yes? But I'm kind of dumb. So I basically realized that this was an opportunity to do something a little different. And that is to create a national museum that, first of all, is a place to live with Mr. Johnson's words, a place to help us to remember, a place to help us to find meaning in the African American experience. It's a place to help us remember, the names we know, maybe in new ways, to think differently about Martin Luther King Jr. or Sojourner Truth or Harriet Tubman or Rosa Parks. But it also has to be a site that allows us to remember the people we don't know. It has to be a site that allows us to remember the enslaved woman who got up every morning on a plantation in North Carolina and fed her children and made sure that when she came home, the field didn't strip her of her humor, of her humanity, of her sense of family. It has to remind us of the family that left Mississippi in 1913 for the south side of Chicago, hoping for a better day. It has to remind us of the Jewish student that left Brandeis in 1964 to risk her life to register voters in Alabama. And it has to remind us of the sharecropper who lost his land in 1964 because he had the audacity to vote in Albany, Georgia. In essence, it has to be a site that allows us as Americans to wrestle with our tortured racial past. It has to be a place that helps us look candidly and clearly at issues of enslavement, of segregation, of racial and sexual violence. It has to help us look at the unmet expectations of so many who made the Great Migration to northern and western cities. So in essence, it has to be a place on the one hand that makes us cry, that makes us remember that pain, that loss. But it also has to be a place that allows us to capture the joy in the African American community. It has to be a place that lets us tap our toe to Duke Ellington or Aretha Franklin or Sam Cooke or somebody from the hip-hop generation who I have no idea who it is. It has to be a place that allows us to understand that this too is all of our stories. It has to be a place, however, that does more than simply remember. Because if it's simply remembered, maybe it doesn't need to be a national museum, but that rather the great strength in crafting a National Museum of African American History and Culture today is that we have the opportunity to craft it as an entity that uses African American culture as a lens to understand what it means to be an American. Not what it means to be an African American, but what it means to be an American. Think about it. This museum's greatest challenge is that it must recenter race in our American discourse. It must frame it in such a way so that all of us, regardless of race, regardless of whether we are from the North or the South, regardless of whether our families have been here 200 years or came here 20 minutes ago, we must recognize that this is your story, that this is profoundly the experience that shaped who we were, who we are, and even who we can become. In essence, what's crucially important to make clear is we should not create a national museum that is an African American museum by African Americans for African Americans. In essence, when one looks at core American values of resiliency, of optimism, of spirituality, where better than to look within the African American community for the roots of these? When one wants to look at the promise of American life or the limits of that promise, where better to look than within the African American experience? So that in essence, the goal is to create a museum that allows us to see that all of our histories, all of our experiences are shaped profoundly by the African American experience. So it's that two-sided coin that gives you a deep insider's perspective, ripe with scholarship of African American culture. But it also frames that culture in such a way that it helps us all understand that this is our story as well. The issue that has been the most difficult has been building the collections, because my goal was never to craft a museum that takes everything African American from the rest of the Smithsonian and puts it in this museum. Rather, the goal is to make sure that African American experiences are explored at the Air and Space Museum or the Smithsonian American Art Museum or American History. So the goal is to realize that when I came, we had no collections, and now we've collected over 20,000 objects over the last several years. And what's been wonderful is how it's happened. We could not afford to buy stuff. We just don't have that kind of money. And remember, when I started my career, you could get things from Hollywood for free. Now everybody wants to sell it to Planet Hollywood or Hard Rock Cafe, and so you can't get it for free. But what's been wonderful is that we created programs that allow us to go around the country and work with people, and collections come our way. So, for example, our signature program is called Saving African American Treasures, where we go around the country, we go into a city, and we bring Smithsonian conservation and preservation experts. And we basically go in a couple days before, do all the media, and do an antique roadshow. Bring out your stuff. And people come out by the hundreds. But the goal is not to tell them how much it's worth, but rather to tell them, here's how you protect your great-grandma's shawl. or here's how you handle that daguerreotype from the 1840s. But what happens is that when they bring this, often they want to give it to you. Well, part of what we do is make sure that most of what people want to give, when we're in Chicago, we say, give it to the DeSable Museum or the Chicago History Museum. So therefore, the local museums benefit when we come to town. But if it's, in the scholarly parlance, if it's really cool, it's coming back to DC. And let me just give you two examples of how this is played out. We were doing this on St. Helena's Island outside of Charleston, South Carolina, Gullah country. And usually when we do these events, they're all the experts on conservation, which means I got nothing to do. So I hold up a wall like a New Jersey teenager, basically standing out of the way. A woman comes to me and says, would you take a moment and look at this pillowcase? Now I gotta be honest, I don't know much about pillowcases. Well, it turned out it was a pillowcase that was stitched or embroidered by an enslaved woman 2 days after she learned she was about to be sold away from her daughter. So on the pillowcase it said, inside is a dress and my love. And I suddenly realized that we all know about people being separated, but to be able to tell that story through that lens, and it was kept in the family for 5 generations, and the mother never did see her daughter again. These are the kind of things people trust us and bring to us. But the other thing that really got me was, I got a call one morning from a collector who said, I know you won't believe this, but I got Harriet Tubman material. Now, I'm a 19th century historian. There's no Harriet Tubman material. Well, this guy said to me that Harriet Tubman's great-great-great niece had died and had left him a box of material, and that he thought about selling it, but he realized that maybe it ought to go to this new museum. Well, I didn't really believe this, but of course I took the train that afternoon to Philadelphia to see the box. And he reached into this box, he took me to a library, and he reached into this box, and the first thing he pulled out were photographs of Harriet Tubman's funeral in 1912 that nobody had ever seen. 15 amazing photographs. Then he reached in, and many of you may remember, there's a famous photo of Harriet Tubman 3 days before she dies. She's wrapped in a white shawl. He pulls out that white shawl. And it had been given to Harriet Tubman by Queen Victoria. Now, by this point, everybody in the room is crying, right? Then he reaches in and he pulls out Harriet Tubman's personal hymnal. Now, Harriet Tubman couldn't read, but you know that she went into the South, and often a hymn was a way she alerted people that she was in the region. So here is a hymnal that had all the spirituals that she sang, that she kept for 50 years. So to have this suddenly meant that there were ways to tell a story that we would have never expected. So in some ways, while the challenge has been great finding this, the things that we found have been unbelievably special. And so in some ways, I am really moved by the fact that there really is all of the 20th century and some of the 19th century in the homes, in the basements, in the attics. But sometimes that's not enough. So one of the things we're doing is recognizing that one of the great challenges we have is how deeply can you tell the story of enslavement? So one of the things I've been doing is traveling around the world looking for a slave ship that I can bring up from under the water. And I found 2 slave ships off the coast of South Africa. It's kind of deep and there are a lot of sharks. I think we'll leave those alone. I found a slave ship off the coast of Turks and Caicos, but it has nothing to do with the United States. And then I got lucky. I found a ship, or I think I found a ship, that left Bristol, Rhode Island, and left Bristol and went to Cape Coast in Ghana. We've got the records that it picked up 144 enslaved Africans. They were on their way to an American-owned plantation in Cuba when they sank off a reef off of Matanzas, which is 60 miles east of Havana. And that's what we've been going after. So I have been spending 5 trips in the last year going to Cuba, working with the US government, which is an old book on itself, working with the Cuban government, which is 3 books. And basically, we're now at a point where this summer, we will actually bring the sort of sonographic material, equipment, and map where we think the reef is and where the ship may be. And for me, what's important about it is the deal that I've cut with the Cuban government is, if we find it, 9/10 of it stays in Cuba and allows Cuba to begin the conversation it wants to now have about race in Cuba. But all I need is a piece of the True Cross. To be able to bring something back from the hull of a slave ship is really going to be the kind of thing that makes the museum special. So in some ways, we have really been fortunate in finding the wondrous collections. But I think the final challenge for me that continues to be the challenge that is most problematic is the challenge of building the building. I got to tell you, when I agreed to come back, I was living in Chicago, and it was announced in the newspapers while I was overseas. So I was gone for a couple days. When I got back home, there were 15 packets from architects sitting on my door saying, "I'm ready to build your building." Now, I had no idea where the building would be, but they were ready. And what's been wonderful is that before the process, architects were giving me drawings of what the building would be. And my favorite is the architect who gave us 150 pages of drawings of a building that was going to be right next to the Washington Monument in the shape of a Black Power fist. Now, there are many things I can do, but I'm not convinced I can sell that to Congress. So then he went back and said, well, if you don't like that, he gave me more drawings of a building underground, invisible, underground railroad. It took me a while to get it. I go, okay, no, we're not going there. But the challenge really has been, okay, what does a building of African American culture look like? Does it have to be in that neoclassic style that's along the mall? Does it look like something African? Does it look African American? And what does that mean? If this was a building that was being built in 1900, you might say most African Americans still lived in the South. Maybe there's Southern motifs. But the real challenge was trying to figure out, how do I answer the query time and time again? What does this building look like? Well, for me, the issue was not about did it look like the South or Africa, but rather, how do you craft a building that speaks of optimism and uplift? How do you craft a building that talks about a permanent dark presence that has always been in the United States and America? And so one of the things we had to do, and in fact I would argue the biggest challenge, was actually figuring out who you're going to hire to build this building. From the day I came back to the Smithsonian, African American architects came to me and said, we never get a chance to build buildings like this, never on the National Mall, so you've got to make sure it's an African American architect. I had others who came to me and said, it's got to be an American architect. I don't care who, as long as they're an American. There were members of Congress who whispered that in my ear. But I wanted architects that reflected what I believed in, which was, if this is the quintessential American story that everybody owns, then let me have a diverse team of architects to do this. So we did an international competition where architects from around the world, 75 teams from around the world, submitted to drawings and ideas. And then we narrowed it down to 6, and I decided to have all 6 make a model, and we exhibit them on the mall so I could get feedback. But I must admit, the day we chose an architect was the worst night of my life sleeping, because thinking, if you choose the wrong architect and build an ugly building, that's all people are going to say. We ended up going with an architectural team that is led by a man named David Adjaye, who is this brilliant young black Brit. And it's a wonderfully diverse team. But what has been really powerful about it is that I didn't really know what we wanted, but But what was wonderful is that as they've come up with what this building is, I think it says many, many important things for us. Let me conclude by simply saying that part of what is crucial is the realization that this is not just about building a good museum. It's not just about crafting nice exhibitions or even finding collections that are wondrous. It really is, how do you build a building that's worthy not just of the Smithsonian, but of the richness of the African American experience? In essence, if we do our job right, this really will be a place that will allow the public to clearly understand where we once were and understand better where we are now and really kind of point us towards what we can become. And when I worry about, when a reporter said to me the other day, she asked me, well, what happens if you fail? It never even dawned on me that you could even fail. And I realize why we won't fail based on the final story I will tell you. The only superstition I have is before I get on an airplane, I have my shoe shine. Planes never crash if you have shined shoes. I've learned that over the years. So I basically know every shoe shine guy in every airport around the country. I was recently in Austin, Texas, and I had done my 3 days of television, media, and everything, and the plane was delayed, so I went to get my shoe shined. It was an elderly African-American man, and he's shining my shoes. And he looks up and he says, "Are you that museum guy that was on TV?" And I said, "Yes." He doesn't say anything else. He shines my shoes. When he finishes, I give him $6. He says, "Keep the money for the museum." Now, I got to be honest. I really felt this guy's a shoe shine guy. He needed that $6. So I pushed it back. And then he said to me, he said, "Don't you understand? I'm not sure what a museum is, but this may be the only place where my grandchildren will ever understand what life did to me and what I did to life." So for me, that's why I know it won't fail, because this is not about what the New York Times says. It's about helping that man be positioned in history where he deserves to be. Thank you very much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.